And if this is your first time giving your mind a little love, I have a few goodies for you. First, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And second, sign up for the Morning Mind Love. Think of it like a weekday oracle from your highest self to help you start each day with a positive focus. Plus, you'll get 2 gifts absolutely free: a 30-minute binaural meditation and 30 days of journaling prompts to help you remember who you truly are. So join over 9,000 people and go to mindlove.com to sign up. Welcome to Mind Love, episode 306. Today's episode is all about Stoicism for self-inquiry, inner discipline, and seeing through our self-distorted perceptions.
We reject often our best thoughts, our first thoughts, our original genius, the things that are most particular and unique to us, for no other reason than that they are ours. We tend to undervalue ourselves. And so one of Emerson's big teachings around originality as well as nonconformity is learning to trust our original nature, to trust our unique voice. And that takes work. Buckminster Fuller, the systems theorist, said, everyone is born a genius, but the process of living de-geniuses us. We get de-geniused by the desire for approval, the impulse to conform, and conditioning, education that doesn't teach us to trust what's unique to us.
Turn up your frequency with Mind Love. Bite-sized brain hacks for seekers, dreamers, and doers. It's time to give your mind a little love with your host, Melissa Monti.
If this is your first time giving your mind a little love, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Mind love is a habit, and the more you give your mind that love and intention, the better you'll feel about yourself and your life. Plus, it's really a win-win because more subscribers means Mind Love attracts even more amazing guests to bring you their wisdom. So don't forget to subscribe. You know that feeling, right? When you're stuck in a loop of worries, imagining all sorts of disastrous scenarios and feeling your anxiety rise. Or when you find yourself catastrophizing, like blowing the tiniest things completely out of proportion. If this resonates with you, well, you're not alone. It's a pretty common human tendency, yet it can be awfully draining and even harmful if we allow ourselves to be consumed by it. There's an ancient wisdom that's been around since the time of the ancient Greeks that might help you rewire this negative thinking. And it's all about altering our perspective for the better, just as we like to do here at Mind Love. This wisdom finds its roots in Stoicism, and it's a little thing known as premeditation. But it's more than just a trick, it can actually be life-changing. So what is Stoicism all about? Well, at its core, Stoicism is a philosophy that empowers us to choose our judgments. Stoics believe that nothing in this vast universe is intrinsically good or bad, value or valueless. It's actually us, the humans, who assign these labels. Remember what Shakespeare's Hamlet said? There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So what he's essentially saying is that our minds are the artists who paint our experiences as either good or bad. Now here's the magic of it all. Since we have control over our minds, we have the power to influence our feelings, especially the negative ones. In other words, Stoicism sheds light on that little space that exists between the events we experience and how we interpret them. Let's paint a picture here. Imagine someone throws an insult your way and calls you a dumbass. In that seemingly insignificant yet potent moment, you have the chance to hit the pause button and ask yourself, how will I judge this? You can also take it a step further and think, how will I respond? Or here's my favorite reflection exercise. Does this remark tell more about them or more about me? Or for an even kinder perspective, does this say more about me as a person, or does it reflect what they're currently going through? There are all sorts of ways that you can challenge your thoughts a little bit. But ultimately, we hold the reins when it comes to which thoughts we fuel with our emotional and behavioral energy. Powerful stuff, isn't it? So Stoicism isn't just some ancient philosophy. It's even influenced a highly effective therapeutic approach called cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's actually a pretty practical mindset reframe that can help us navigate life more easily. So today we're diving into all that Stoicism has to offer us with Mark Matusik. He's an award-winning author, teacher, and speaker whose work focuses on transformative writing for personal, professional, and spiritual development. He's the founder of the Seekers Forum, an online community for writing and self-inquiry, and the author of 8 books, including Lessons from an American Stoic, How Emerson Can Change Your Life. 3 key things we will learn are how self-inquiry can help us see ourselves more clearly, how crisis and disaster can be liberating, and how our shadow parts can be a guide for growth. When you're growing a business, most people think the hardest part is getting clients or making money. But I think it's finding people who actually care about the work as much as you do. And I've been there. I've posted a job, got 100 applications, and maybe 3 of them actually read the job description. And it's kind of soul crushing when you're trying to build something that actually matters. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job posts seen by other job sites. Indeed's sponsored jobs help you stand out and hire fast. With sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates so that you can reach the people you want faster. And it makes a huge difference. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. One of the things I love about Indeed is that it just makes hiring so fast because you're reaching people who actually are looking for work, not just casually browsing. Plus, with Indeed sponsored jobs, there's no monthly subscriptions, no long-term contracts, and you only pay for results. And guess how fast it is? In the minute I've been talking to you, 23 hires were made on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. There's no need to wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of the show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/mindlove. Just go to Indeed.com/mindlove right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/mindlove. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. I used to be one of those people who had grand plans for a big healthy meal every Sunday night, and I'd make these elaborate meal plans, buy all the ingredients, and then Wednesday would roll around and I'd be staring at that wilted spinach, ordering takeout again. Shopping, planning, and cooking food really can be simple and stress-free, and that's why I love Hungry Root. Hungry Root takes stress out of mealtime by filling your cart with personalized picks and planning your week of meals, getting smarter with every order. With over 15,000 recipes to choose from each week, many ready in just 15 minutes or less, it's so perfect for those nights when you have no energy left. What I love most is their smart cart technology. It actually learns what I like and what I will actually cook. So no more buying ingredients for recipes that I'll never make. Everything that shows up, I actually use. They screen out over 200 additives, including high fructose corn syrup and artificial sweeteners, only high quality meat and seafood with no hormones or antibiotics, and they carry brands like Vital Farms and Ithaca hummus that I already trust. The time I've gotten back has been incredible. Instead of spending Sunday meal planning, I'm doing things that actually matter to me. Take advantage of this exclusive offer. For a limited time, get 40% off your first box, plus get a free item in every box for life. Go to hungryroot.com/mindlove and use code mindlove. That's hungryroot.com/mindlove, code mindlove to get 40% off your first box and a free item of your choice for life. hungryroot.com/mindlove, code mindlove. And now let's welcome Mark Matusik to the show.
Thank you, Melissa. Great to be here.
So what led your interest in Stoicism?
Well, I grew up with a lot of difficulties in the family home, and I was looking from a really young age for ways to find my way through a lot of chaos and confusion and adversity. And so I wanted a philosophy that was practical and that could help me kind of clear away a lot of the things I didn't understand about the world I was growing up in. So when I discovered Emerson when I was in college, it was a huge awakening for me because I realized that there were very hands-on practical lessons that we could apply to the difficulties of a crazy world and a difficult life. Many of us grew up in dysfunctional families, and I'm no exception. So for me, Stoicism was a lifeline to pull myself up out of a lot of trauma and suffering around me.
Why do you think the world in its current state could benefit from the philosophy of Stoicism?
Well, the premise of Stoicism is learning to optimize negative states of mind. So, when you find yourself in the midst of adversity, how can you turn the obstacle upside down, as the Stoics said? How can you use the adversity as to become the solution itself? And that's what a lot of us are trying to do these days, because obviously the world is a mess, and there's a lot of danger. We're at a real inflection point as a democracy. And so people want a sturdy rope to hold on to. And that's what Stoicism is. It gives you very practical, spiritual exercises for dealing with the uncertainties and the sometimes overwhelming confusions of the contemporary world.
Yeah, I feel like so often our natural tendencies as a society go in the opposite direction of what's actually good for us.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it's true. And that's what happens when we lose our spiritual footing, which is the basis of my new book about Emerson, is that we've lost our philosophical grounding as a culture. And so when materialism takes over, when egotism takes over, and we lose a sense of there being a power that's larger than we are, whatever you want to call that power, we're doomed. We're lost. And the problem is that we tend to sink to the lowest common denominator as human beings. So unless we have a kind of a higher calling or a message that elevates us and pulls us beyond our selfishness and our egotism, then we tend to just go in the direction of least resistance, which has to do with generally around greed and fear, insecurity, tribalism, etc. So we really need a leg up out of that kind of mediocrity that we can sink into as human beings.
When I'm reading a book and they mention some source that they found it from, I usually will write it down. So I've got this huge list of all these things, kind of following the thread of knowledge, as I like to call it. And literally 3 times in the last week and a half, Emerson has come up. And before your book, I had only really, seen a random Emerson quote here and there. I didn't even know him well enough to really understand what his main philosophy was. I just knew he was pretty good with words.
Good with an epigram, good with a quote.
Yes, exactly. I'm like, oh, this is quotable. This belongs on Instagram. I'm sure that's exactly why he was writing, right? But one of the teachings that you bring up in the beginning of your book is around self-reliance and how it's actually a spiritual practice. Can you go deeper on that?
Yeah, this is huge. And it's actually the single greatest misconception about Emerson's teaching was that people confuse self-reliance with selfishness or self-absorption. And a lot of folks in the right wing have kind of taken self-reliance to mean, no welfare state, no nanny state. Everyone has to depend on themselves. But that's not at all what self-reliance meant to Emerson. Emerson said that self-reliance is reliance on God. However you conceive God, Buddha nature, universal intelligence, however you conceive of a power larger than we are. Self-reliance has to be connected to that, or it just becomes egomania. He said that there is nothing so weak as an egotist. So self-reliance as a spiritual practice means connecting to the force that's larger than we are, recognizing the interconnection and the interdependence of all living beings, and touching into the part of ourselves, he called it our genius. It's the part of ourselves that's bigger than our personality. We all are aware of it. There's something about us. There's a Melissa-ness that has followed you throughout your life. It was with you when you were a little girl. It was with you when you were a younger woman, and it's still with you now. And it's bigger and deeper than just your personality. And when we touch into that essence of who we are, which is actually a spiritual quality, that's when we cultivate self-reliance, genuine self-reliance, the way Emerson meant it, which is, as I said, it's not the same as looking out for number one, which is what we're taught to do in this culture. It's about looking out for number one in a world of other number ones, and really joining the human race in a more profound way.
I wrote down a quote that I loved that said, "We do not determine what we think. We only open our senses, clear away as we can all obstruction from the facts, and let God think through us." And I love that perspective because I've always been, well, probably for the last 15 years, been on a pretty deep spiritual journey. Right now, I'm listening to a talk by Ram Dass around becoming nobody and just talking about how we kind of put on these suits and we become different people or become a character, and we forget to kind of look beyond that to figure out what's really under that. And it's interesting when you think about this idea of individuality, because I think so many of us cling to originality, as you call it, in a form of the personality selves that we've created, but we forget to kind of look deeper at that self with a capital S to figure out what's original about us on a soul level, if that makes sense.
That's exactly right. That's exactly the point. Emerson talked about the one mind or the overmind or the oversoul. He had many different words for it. That is where our thoughts are coming from. Anyone who has ever tried to meditate will tell you that they can't control their thoughts. Thoughts come from we don't know where, and they go on their own time. So mindfulness isn't about controlling our thoughts. It's about changing how we relate to our thoughts and recognizing that the witness in us is bigger than our thoughts. And it's that witness that is the quality you're talking about that's bigger than the personality. I worked with Ram Dass on one of his last books right after he had his stroke. I helped him for a year working on his book about conscious aging. And he said it to me over and over again that the one thing that doesn't diminish as we get older is wisdom. Everything else falls away, everything else atrophies and gets worse, but wisdom actually builds. And wisdom comes from being attuned to that one mind that we all share. And when you are aware of that, you're not as threatened by your thoughts. You're not as, and you're not as determined to try to control the mind, which, as you know, just creates more stress. I can remember the first time I was on a meditation retreat, just spending. It was a silent retreat for 2 weeks, and I just spent most of the time just in agony, trying to make my thoughts go away until I finally got that it was a losing battle. And that the best thing that we can do is to allow the thoughts to come, realize that we are not the thoughts, that the witness part of who we are is bigger than our thoughts. And then the thoughts aren't as threatening. Then they come in and they go. As Ram Dass used to say, you just invite them in like little schmooze instead of being so threatened by your fears and your thoughts. You say, come in and have some tea. It's a very different approach to negative thinking and to hyper cogitation than we usually take in an egotistical culture where we're trained to control everything. We're always at odds with ourselves. We're always in conflict. And what spiritual life, no matter what the path does is it ends that conflict. It really makes us see that we are bigger than our minds.
I had this whole thought train just yesterday, actually. And it's funny because if somebody comes to me with a problem, I can very clearly be that kind of reflection for people of these are just thoughts that you don't need to attach to them. But of course, it's a lot more difficult to do with myself sometimes, although I have gotten a lot better at creating that habit over the years. But one that I noticed just yesterday, it was a really rainy, gloomy day, and I always feel very low energy and almost depressed on those types of days. And it usually happens before I even realize the weather. And so that was sort of happening. And I'm like, man, this day sucks for some reason. I don't know what it is. And then I'm like, oh, it's the weather. I'm like, oh, I hate the rain. And then I stopped because I'm in the middle of listening to that Ram Dass lecture as well as going through your book for this interview. And I stopped and I kind of just laughed at myself. And I'm like, and I used Byron Katie's The Work. And I was just like, is that true? Do I actually hate the rain? And so I started to question that and challenge it. And all of a sudden it was crazy, the almost visceral response I had to this. It was like literally and figuratively a cloud lifted. And suddenly I was noticing how fresh the rain smelled and how beautiful the air felt. And it was like the perfect temperature. And I had this moment of realizing, like 3 seconds ago, I almost felt miserable and now I feel elated. And all it took was questioning one thought. And to your point, realizing that we don't need to identify with them. And so suddenly I just saw it as a thought that I have grown habit to attaching to. And who would I be if I just let that thought float away and just create a whole new one? And so all of a sudden I was like, I love the rain. And it completely transformed my entire day.
Right. You changed the story.
Yeah, and it's so much easier than I thought it would have been 10 seconds before that.
Yeah. And that's because, as Byron Katie always says, the mind is like a child and it believes what we tell it until we question what it's telling us, until we question our thoughts. And so you questioned it and you realized, and then you came into the moment of actually smelling the rain and feeling how you actually were. And you realized that the thoughts were just a narrative and that narrative was not the truth. And realizing that it's a quantum leap in self-awareness. The vast majority of people don't know that they are not their thoughts. We're so completely identified with our minds, particularly in this culture, with no transcendental perspective or context. We believe that we are our minds, and that's why depression rates and suicide rates and addiction rates are through the roof, because we're completely identified with our pain. And that's one thing that Emerson talks about a lot, is that when you realize that pain is connected to what he called the exterior life, it's not part of who we actually are essentially. And that's a breath of fresh air. That's a huge relief when you realize that you don't have to be trapped inside this helmet of worry and stress and bad thoughts.
I have overcome a lot of different addictive tendencies, full-blown addictions, eating disorders, things like that throughout my life. And it seems like whenever one is overcome, there's a new one that pops up. And the message that I keep getting recently is around materialism. And I'm like a full-blown Taurus, if you're into astrology. Like there's like something deep in my nature that loves materialistic things. And I really think that they make me happy, at least for a few minutes after I receive something new. And thank you, Amazon, for just being my current drug dealer. Yes. And so I've been loving reading your book just because it's another way for me to kind of go inward when I feel myself reaching outward. But one of the things that Emerson talks about is using self-inquiry as a doorway to wisdom. What are some of the ways that you use this?
Well, primarily through writing. And, I teach writing for self-inquiry and writing for self-realization. I teach a method called Writing to Awaken. And what we do is use very targeted, pointed prompts for penetrating through the belief systems and the mind stories that are weighing us down. So for me, writing is a great way of doing self-inquiry. I've been doing it since I was a kid. When I was growing up in that household I was telling you about, I started to write when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, when I was so confused, there was nobody to talk to. And so I would just lock myself in the bathroom, usually, because it was the only place I had any privacy. And I would just say, what's going on? And I would write it down. And I found that when I did that, I immediately felt better. It's not that the problems went away, but I felt like I had perspective and that I was grounded in myself. It gave me back my core, you could say. So for me, writing has been a lifelong practice of self-inquiry and using self-observation as a path of freedom. But of course, we can do it many other ways. People go to therapy, deep dialogue, deep conversation can serve some of that same purpose. But what matters is that we really ask deep questions, which is something that we're not trained to do. But until you ask the question, very often you can't open the door. The question is the key. And so one of the things I teach people to do is to find the key, find the right question. What is actually hurting you? What do you actually long for? Where do you feel inauthentic? Where are you not telling the truth? That's another great question to explore. So whether through writing or another means, asking questions is the key, is the path to freedom and self-knowledge. That's why when Socrates said, know thyself, he was saying you need to ask yourself questions in order to know yourself. The unexamined life isn't worth living. And how do we examine ourselves? We examine ourselves through questions. It's actually our superpower, and it's one that we don't pay enough attention to.
I love that prompt. Where are you not telling the truth? I feel like I could sit with that one for a while.
You could, we all could. It's a huge question, and it's a question that's ever renewing. So you can write about that question, every day and get different answers. And that's why writing for self-inquiry, writing to awaken, which is what I teach, is a practice, because it goes on and on. I have people who have taken the same self-inquiry classes with me for years with the same topics, and I say, well, why do you keep coming back to the same class? And they say, I keep getting different answers. So that's the beauty of self-inquiry, is it's always renewing itself, and you always get new information. And it's really useful sometimes to even ask yourself the same question day after day for a week, and notice how your response evolves and how you get deeper into the answer.
A few years ago, I was meditating, and I use self-inquiry quite often in my long walks or during meditation, because I can just have these really long inner dialogues with myself. And it's kind of fun, because sometimes I think I know the answer until I dialogue for long enough, and then I'm like, oh, I didn't even see that in myself, or that would not have come up in the first minute, but in minute 15 it finally does. But one of the things that popped up and I wrote in my journal years back was that I started to believe that the purpose of life was to know yourself and understand yourself. And so when I read that, that's something that Emerson also believed, I was like, yes, that must have been from source or universal consciousness in some way.
Yes, and yeah, it was, and it is, and you find it in all of the great spiritual traditions. Is this injunction to discover who you are, whatever means you use. Until we do that, whether we're practicing Buddhism or Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or Islam, until you do that, you're living as a stranger to yourself. Your life is a case of mistaken identity. People talk about imposter syndrome. Well, gosh, we are, all of us, imposters until we take this journey towards self-knowledge, because otherwise we are masquerading as the personality, which is nothing but many different stories and emotions and biases, and all kind of congealed into an idea of self. That's not who we are. And that's the value of crisis and disaster, as many people found during the pandemic, is that it explodes the story. It suddenly you can't rely on the old narrative anymore. And while that's disconcerting, it's also liberating. And you can see yourself in new ways. And many people, as the externals fell away during the pandemic, were able to see themselves in their lives in very different ways, because they were not just caught in the kind of the trance of habit and the trance of conditioned living. And so that's what any spiritual practice worth its salt does, is it shakes up your idea of self, and it puts you in touch with the thing that doesn't change, the thing in you that is bigger than your circumstances. But until you do that, until any of us does that, we're living on the surface of things. And that was Emerson's great fear, was that he and that the people he cared about, even his audiences, his readers, would stay on the outside of things, the surface of life. Life has a lot of beautiful surfaces, but they are only surfaces. Until we penetrate those, and get to the heart of the matter, then we might as well, not be here at all. That's why they said the unexamined life is not worth living, because it loses a central value. Because, as you said, our purpose here is to know ourselves. It's why we have a human incarnation, is to realize who we are. But that takes practice.
I have always sort of been a rebel. And so I loved the whole section on originality because I think when I was younger, it was something that I feel was looked down upon in many of my environments. And now I'm lucky because I work for myself. I've created kind of my own life. And so none of that stuff really burdens me much anymore. I mean, it still does. Of course, we all still want to belong and fit in, and one harsh comment can send me in a spiral. But for the most part, I feel like I've created a life that I've really wanted. It's something I've been working on for like 8 years now. And so there's a lot of people, though, that I know that are living kind of on autopilot, and they don't even see it because, they're not used to self-inquiry, but you don't realize how we just get stuck in habits and kind of just keep doing the same thing over and over again in order to kind of fit in and belong and be accepted and all of that. And one of the things that just really struck a chord that helped me to sort of see a shadow where, I don't know, sometimes when I think I'm beyond something, but then one little sentence will make me realize how foolish that is. But it was the sentence that said, "We often reject our originality for no other reason than that it is ours." And in just that sentence, I was able to sort of conjure up a bunch of things in myself that I reject or I beat up, whether it's looks or parts of my personality. What do you mean by that sentence? Can you go deeper on that?
Yeah, well, just as you were saying, we reject often our best thoughts, our first thoughts, our original genius, the things that are most particular and unique to us, for no other reason than that they are ours. We tend to undervalue ourselves and undervalue other people. And so one of Emerson's big teachings around originality, as well as nonconformity, is learning to trust our original nature, to trust our unique voice. And that takes work. Elsewhere, he says something, I paraphrase, but it's something like the greatest accomplishment is to live your own life in a world that is constantly trying to make you live someone else's. And it's going against the current to say, no, I'm going to listen to myself. I'm going to trust myself. We're not taught to do that. We're taught by well-meaning parents to toe the line and color inside the lines and get along, and of course they want us to be socialized and not be outsiders. But we lose so much of our particularity and our own joy by imitating other people. Buckminster Fuller, the systems theorist, said everyone is born a genius, but the process of living de-geniuses us. And that's what you're talking about. We get de-geniused by the desire for approval, the impulse to conform, and conditioning, education that doesn't teach us to trust what's unique to us. We're always taught to look outside for answers. When in all of your education were you ever taught to look inside for answers? It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, that knowledge came after I was out of official schooling and started seeking on my own.
Exactly.
And I just found it so funny that I had this whole story in my head about, again, it's another area that I think I've evolved beyond or something like that. And then I'm like, even this is a story that I'm habituated to saying. And if I would just, I don't know, stop thinking I'm above or beyond anything, then there's always more shadows to kind of shed light on. You had a quote in the book also by Jung who said, "You do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And I was like,
yes.
All right, that's going to be another affirmation that goes on my wall as well. You had a quote in the book also by Jung who said, "You do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And I was like,
Yes.
all right, that's going to be another affirmation that goes on my wall as well.
And that's huge, especially in the spiritual world. There's so much desire to kind of leap into the light, and sort of skip the mess, skip the crooked parts, the mismatched parts, the shadow parts. But that's where our character comes from. That's where you can't have yin without yang. That's where our depth comes from, is from our shadow parts, and getting to know them and making space for them to be there. One of Waldo's big insights is what he called the law of compensation, which is that for every sweet, there's a sour. For every sour, there's a sweet. And that for every virtue you have, that it has a negative side. And for every negative quality you have, there is a virtue. And so when you look at life in that circular way, in a non-dual way, you realize you can't get rid of your devils, so to speak, without also losing your angels. So looking at the shadow doesn't mean getting rid of the contents of the shadow. It means honoring them and seeing where the gifts are that you may have overlooked in the shadow, and allowing that you're always going to have imperfections and parts of yourself that are not what you want them to be, and you're going to have greed, and you're going to have envy, and you're going to have insecurity, and all of these human emotions. That's not a problem. In fact, each of those has a positive quality to them if we take the time to look at it carefully. But what happens is that we just reject them out of hand. We avoid the shadow, we reject our faults, and we end up missing what they have to teach us. Because our faults, of course, like all of our losses, all pain, is a guide if we listen to it. What is it trying to teach us? And until we take the time to ask that question, we don't really grow. Until that time, we're just really victims, kind of, the victims of circumstance, and we feel like life is happening to us. And we forget that, in fact, this is a big cosmic classroom that we're in, and that there's information in even negative and painful experiences that if we don't look at, we're really missing the point. This is a really crucial thing that we need to look at, particularly in a culture like ours that doesn't appreciate vulnerability, and it's all about meritocracy and achievement and getting ahead. We need to take a big step back and a big step inside to acknowledge who we really are. And when we do that, it makes us empathic toward other people as well. Because, of course, one of the reasons we reject the other is that we reject the other in ourselves. And as long as we do that, the world is going to be in turmoil.
Yeah, that's been a big lesson for me, is that when I find myself feeling really judgmental towards other people, I know that there's something about that that's starting within myself, and vice versa. When I feel I'm beating myself up, I'm like, man, this is a big blind spot in compassion for others as well. And so it's always sort of reflecting it back to me. And I think one of the things that I'm learning is that we live in such a linear world. It's like time moves forward, success is up a ladder. And so I have often looked at my own spiritual growth in that same way, like I'm moving up some ladder of enlightenment. And I think that does a real disservice because, like I said before, as soon as I think I'm over something, it seems to come and bite me back in the ass. And so one thing that I heard Ram Dass say recently was, he was just talking about something completely different, but he was talking about different dimensions or on a different plane. And he's like, and don't think of it as a higher or lower dimension. And there's something about that just sort of snapped into me where I'm like, why am I looking at my growth in that way at all either? As you said, we're in a more circular world. Everything is, all of those shadows are existing at once. And one thing's not lower or higher than the other. It's all still there. All still needs light. All still needs to be looked at. And so rather than thinking that I've moved above or beyond something, I'm starting to expect that it's still just going to be there. And maybe it's just not bugging me quite as much as it was the day before.
Exactly. And this is a really important point, because we set ourselves up for a fall when we think that our wounds are going to go away or our triggers are going to go away. They don't go away, but how we relate to them changes. I think of it as more of a spiral. You come around and you're in a similar place, but you're a little bit, you have a little more objectivity about it. You're a little bit more disidentified from it. But the issue was never going to go away. I can tell you, I've spent a lot of time with many great spiritual teachers over the years, and they all have their issues. Every single one of them, the most enlightened masters in the world have dealt with their greed and their envy and their insecurity and their selfishness and their will to power and their human failings. It's part of being a human being. One of the things I appreciated so much about Ram Dass was he was so transparent about his own failings, and he always called himself a work in progress. And when he didn't die from his stroke, for example, he realized, I have a lot more work to do, and he did. And so when we look at ourselves with humility, instead of trying to get somewhere, trying to achieve some state of perfection, we come much closer to the truth of things. The greatest teachers are always the most humble. So the minute anyone tells you that they're over it or that they've moved beyond, you should run in the other direction. There's a wonderful talk by a psychologist named Pauline Boss called "The Myth of Closure," and she talks about this idea that that our wounds are going to close and that our pain is going to somehow, there's going to be this closure to it, is a complete illusion. And if we believe that, we're always going to feel like, what am I doing wrong? Why can't I make that go away? Because nothing goes away. Nothing goes away, but we can include it in who we are. We can get bigger, in terms of more mentally expansive, so that it's not as threatening to us. But go away? Absolutely not. It's not how healing works.
You touched on it earlier around the teaching that the qualities that we resist in ourselves are actually crucial to our wholeness. What is an example of someone channeling a trait that they might perceive as negative into something positive?
Oh, gosh. Well, I can use myself as an example. I used to be extremely insecure and very introverted, and I had a lot of trouble connecting to people. So I became very nosy in conversation. I would ask questions sort of nonstop as a way of covering up my own insecurities. And it's how I learned how to bond from the time I was a very young kid. And eventually that turned into my career. Turned into my work as a journalist first, and as a writer, now as a teacher. My life has become all about asking questions. But it started for me as kind of a bad habit. I could be pretty obnoxious about it when I was a kid, but I kind of channeled that insecurity in a way that it now informs my work. So that's one example. But I've known people who were, just look at Lizzo. Look at someone like Lizzo. Lizzo is, at one time, Lizzo's obesity would have been the end of her career. There would have been simply no possibility for her to have a career as a pop star if she were trying to hide her obesity, if she was ashamed of her obesity. But what she's done is turned her obesity into a virtue, and look at how people love her for it, and how empowering that message has been for a lot of other people who have quote unquote issues with their weight. So that's what originality does. I used to work for Andy Warhol. This is in the book, and Andy was a very shy, painfully shy, completely weird, outcast kind of guy. He turned all of those weird qualities that were such a burden, so painful to him, into his public image. It became his thing, and it became very cool to be like Andy Warhol. But he started off as somebody who could barely talk to people. He was so inhibited and self-hating. So we can take the things in us that are wounded, that are limitations, that are the sources of pain, make them our own, and then transmute them into something that's creative, that helps us connect with other people, and that helps us to feel more comfortable inside our own skins.
One example with me is around ADHD. When you're a kid, it seems like all of the messages around ADHD are negative. And I didn't get an official diagnosis until I was a little bit older in my teens. And then I remember coming across something fairly early on about the potential for ADHD to be a superpower, and read all of these traits about myself that I already loved because I had never associated them with ADHD. I didn't know. I just knew that when I'm interested in something, I hyper focus. I mean, give me a rabbit hole to go down. If it's one that I actually want to learn about, I would, even in my teens, I would barely sleep and learn everything that there was. And so now to this day, I mean, even recently, there was a rabbit hole that kind of pulled on my thought threads, as I call it, and I couldn't stop reading. I've read like 14 books on one topic in the last like 2 months, just because it's so interesting. But that passion in that area is what helps me do what I do. It's what helps me bring information to other people. And if I were to have only focused on that negative, I know that there's negatives that need to be mitigated, that I have all of my systems to kind of get around and keep me structured and all of that. But it's just in the perspective, which is a whole nother section in your book, that just perspective shift of like, what if this isn't a negative? What if this is just guidance into how I need to structure myself, but it's overwhelmingly a positive? And that's how I've been able to view it since seeing it that way.
Yeah, that's good. That's great. Well, I mean, look at Van Gogh. I mean, the reason Van Gogh painted the way he did is that he had that, that inner ear issue and that condition that he worked with. That's why we have that very unique, style of painting. He wouldn't have had it if he were quote unquote normal. And so, getting over this myth of normal, and instead saying, what can I do with my particular set of limited, imperfect, but interesting, qualities? How can I optimize them? What can I do creatively with them? How can they enlarge me as a person? How can I connect better with other people because of the things that I consider to be my faults or my flaws? That's when we start to live a transformational life. It's all well and good to, when you have, when you're good looking and have a lot of money and you're successful, it's easy to kind of cakewalk through life. But for the other 99% of the world, we're dealing often with what feel like handicaps that we can't overcome. So instead of looking at them as handicaps to be overcome, we can look at them as opportunities to do things differently in a way that's unique to us. And that's when the unique stuff comes out. An even better example, you just asked me about how to turn a weakness to a strength. Someone I interview in the book was a photographer who lost his sight. And everyone said, your career is over. You'll never, obviously you can't take pictures with 3% of your vision left. And he said, to hell with that. He said, I'm going to become the world's first blind photographer. And he invented a whole different way of taking pictures with a large frame camera and using an assistant. And what happened is he went from being a very highly paid, but just sort of average commercial photographer to being a world-class artist. And since he lost his sight, he's had over 40 solo shows around the world with this new body of work that would not have happened if he hadn't gone blind. So this isn't just kind of feel good, hoo-ha. This is a very sophisticated strategy for living. It's a philosophical choice to look at what is there instead of always at what isn't there. And of course, the negativity bias in our brain tends to look for what isn't there. But when we can use what's there in new and creative ways, all kinds of things are possible.
I went through a pretty big trauma in my 20s, and I remember feeling like my life was ruined. And through my process of self-inquiry over the next, took about a decade, what has become my life philosophy now is to use your limitations as guideposts. And so whereas we're used to just kind of seeing all the stop signs of what's been taken away, now I'm like, well, what is this funneling me toward?
Yeah.
And in doing that, it makes everything so easy because then it's like you don't have 1,000 options anymore that you're going between, constantly second guessing yourself if you're choosing the right one. Things being taken away from me has actually been so joyous because I'm like, well, that eliminates 90% of those options. I only have 10% left. This makes my job a whole lot easier.
Exactly. No, exactly right. Yeah, it's true. Your limitations help. They become like guideposts. I think of it as the frame in it with a painting. You don't have a painting without well, you can technically, but you know what I'm saying. A frame, and the idea of limitation is what I'm playing with. The frame is part of what makes the painting possible, and so understanding that your limitations are part of the creative process, they actually help you with the creative process, is a big insight.
One of the things you talk about in your book is that nowhere are we more delusional than in the domain of self appraisal. What do you mean by that?
Well, we all have dysmorphia. We don't see ourselves clearly. It's like we're living with a funhouse mirror or something. When we look inside, the reflection that we see is not the truth. It's not accurate or what other people see. It's filtered through our fears, our desires, our biases, our wounds, and so we don't have a clear vision of ourselves, which is why self-inquiry is so important. So the fact is, we are deluded about who we are, and that's why it's so useful to bounce things off of other people and to have people around us who know us, who can reflect us back to ourselves, because in the funhouse mirror of our own minds, we are distorted. We are sometimes I'm sure you've seen that, where you look at a photograph and all you see is the one thing that you don't like about yourself in the photograph, and someone else looks at it and says you look great. We don't have a clear self-appraisal, and we tend to be perfectionist. We tend to want all of our flaws to be gone, and so we focus on our flaws, and they become exaggerated, and they come to define how we look at ourselves, and that is simply not. It's not based in reality. It's based in our imagination, and so that's why it's really important to question, as we were saying earlier, to question the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Who do you think you are? That's a great question for self-inquiry. Who do you think you are? Describe yourself to someone who's never met you. That could be a very revealing prompt to use with people. Describe yourself to people who've never met you. Describe yourself in 50 words or less to someone who has never met you. If you do that, you'll see what you emphasize, what you miss, where your blind spots are, where your longings are, what you want to be true that you sort of exaggerate. So where we are delusional when it comes to our own self-image.
It reminds me of something Ram Dass said, actually, where like he said something around a painter painting a big gray cloud, but then he puts it in a frame that's too small for it. And so all you see is just gray. And it's like, oh, this is just like a gray picture until you actually take it out of the frame and you see the edges and in the beautiful sky. And in the same way, we are more than we see. And everyone that knows us, including ourselves, doesn't really see the full picture because we're all kind of zooming in on that one thing, the things that are important to us, the way somebody else makes us feel. We characterize everybody, including ourselves. And so I think we'd have to kind of get some feedback to start getting a bigger picture. But I often wonder that, like, what do other people see me as? I did an activity back when I was first starting my entrepreneur journey where I actually asked like 11 people that I knew from different areas of my life, like what my superpower was. And it was just so interesting because I got a lot of very similar responses. And it was something that I didn't see in myself at all at that time. And it was around basically taking information from tons of different sources and connecting it and explaining it in ways that people could understand. And that was not something that I saw in myself at all, and actually ended up giving me the idea to start a podcast with all of the rabbit hole knowledge that I've accumulated over the years.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. No, we don't. That's why we're not islands unto ourselves. We don't have the ability to. We're not omniscient. We don't have 360-degree perspective, and it's important to check in with the people who know us and to be willing to hear what they have to say. Because we don't always want to take that information in. But it's absolutely it's essential, not to get lost in the not to get lost in our own delusions of who we believe ourselves to be, because it's nothing but a myth, and the myths, as we know, can be changed. And that's why the value of crisis and disaster and things going wrong is so important on a spiritual path, because until that happens, it's very easy to keep playing that character, and keep playing until our self-image becomes more and more entrenched. That's also why travel is important and why people love travel so much. It's not just to see new things. It's when you leave your familiar context, you know yourself in a different way. When you see yourself reflected in a different culture, your sense of self expands. And then you start to realize how malleable your sense of self actually is. And that's what spiritual practice does as well. It gives us a larger context. So instead of seeing ourselves as these teeny little personalities, these selfish little people, we realize that we are these extraordinary beings that have a transcendent dimension to us that we have barely begun to explore. And that's when life gets interesting. That's when life gets really exciting.
So we've talked a lot about self-inquiry, but another area that you teach around is around how reasoning has its limitations. And there was a quote by Emerson that said, "Nothing is so conducive to spiritual growth as this capacity for logical and accurate analysis of everything that happens to us." And so I'm curious, that's sort of a pitfall of trying to logic everything, all of our experiences when we're processing it. But that's also part of self-inquiry. So what do we need to sort of be aware of when we're in that process so we don't get caught in the trap of just reasoning?
That's a great question. It's a really important question because, as you say, we rely on reason and rationale to do self-inquiry, but reason itself is a pretty weak instrument, particularly compared to the emotions, for example. The emotions are an ancient part of who we are. Reason is a fairly new development. It's the most recent part of our brain's formation, is the neocortex and the ability to reason. Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist, compares the emotions to an elephant, and then reason is like the little man on the back of the elephant trying to steer it this way or that, and it doesn't work. We can't talk ourselves out of feelings. So all of that is to say that reason is important, it's powerful, and it's limited. So when you're doing self-inquiry isn't just a head practice. Self-inquiry is a whole body practice. So I've always encouraged people to notice how they're feeling in their bodies. What are their emotions telling them? When they write about that, are their hands getting clammy? Where does fear come up? Where do you feel excitement in the body? When does desire come up? All of these things are part of self-inquiry. So you use reason kind of like a flashlight, but a flashlight can only see what's within its perimeter. So we understand that there are things beyond the flashlight. The flashlight kind of helps us to navigate, but it's not the entire picture. The emotions and the intuition, the ineffable parts of who we are as important to our experience as our logical mind and our logical thoughts. So we use it because it's the best we have to work with, but it also can be a pretty weak instrument.
It reminds me of the section of your book around contradiction. I loved this part because it's just goes to show you how we have all of these methods of self-inquiry, like you were just talking about, emotions, reasoning. But there was a quote that said, "No challenge is more paradoxical than untangling our biological, emotional, and spiritual impulses. What the heart desires, the mind often rejects, and what the loins crave may be an anathema to the conscious." I love that because it's like so often I'll be reading a book about like how emotions are a gateway to the soul, and then all of a sudden it's all about emotions.
Right,
And then I get
right.
back into my reasoning brain and it's all about reasoning. But it's so true. It's like you talk about how wisdom is found in the middle way. Talk about that.
Well, that's Buddha, of course, and the fact that we tend toward extremes, we tend toward polarities, and that wisdom and truth are often found in the middle way. The problem is that these different parts of who we are speak different languages. So there's a heart language, there's a head language, there is a gut language, there's a groin language. Different parts of who we are speak different languages and have different impulses. And so what we do to the best of our ability, using this limited rationality, this limited logic that we have, is try to determine what is the golden mean. What is the harmonious center that all of the different languages share. Instead of being pulled in this direction or that direction, we try to say, what is the underlying truth that connects them? So, for example, if your loins are saying one thing and your heart is saying another, and your head is saying another, we try to step back and look at what is the larger truth, which is another way of saying the middle way. What's the larger truth that actually connects these diverse impulses? And it's almost always around love. It's almost always around connection. It's always about freedom. Those are the universals. Those are the universals that can guide us through this cacophony of conflicting desires and conflicting impulses. There are immediate desires, and then there's a larger long-term desire, and so we want to focus as much as possible on the long-term desires, on what are our actual intentions in a larger sense, and that will help to guide us through the confusion when we keep an eye on what is our bigger intention, and not be swayed or deceived by the impulse of the moment, which can just often misleads us. We can't avoid them completely, and there are good things about spontaneity, but when it comes to the big questions in our lives, the big moments in our lives, we want to be able to step back and say, what is my larger intention here? And that's what helps us to find the middle way.
I see a lot of Venn diagrams in my future of processing.
Exactly.
Well, I love leaving listeners with a practice or something for them to focus on to kind of ground what we've been talking about into reality for the week. If you were to give them one thing to focus on, what would that be?
I would start by asking them to take 15 or 20 minutes to write about the question, where in your life do you feel inauthentic, untruthful, or out of integrity? That's a great place to start. And it's a question that we can ask on a regular basis as a way of tuning ourselves to what is deeply true, so that we don't lose sight of the larger intention in the moment to moment confusion of living.
What sorts of answers have you pulled out of yourself when you've asked yourself that question?
Oh gosh, it can be anything from I'm eating too much meat, to that person and I don't belong in each other's lives anymore, to I'm moving in the wrong direction with this book, to I've had enough of that kind of meditation for a while, or that teacher who I don't want to work with anymore. I'm pretty sensitive to my own well-being. I've been doing this for many, many years. And so if I ask myself the question, where do I feel inauthentic, or what story am I telling myself that isn't true? That's another way of asking the same question. I'm able to determine where the pain is, or where the discomfort or the imbalance is pretty quickly. And the more you do it, the more finely attuned you get to your own inner life. Well, that's a good place to start.
Well, thank you so much for all of the passion that you've put into this book. I have been interested in Stoicism for a while. I have Ryan Holiday's The Daily Stoic, but I haven't been able to really visualize all of the core concepts as well as I have with your book now. And we only touched on about 4 of the 12 big lessons in Stoicism in your book. And so, for all of the listeners that are interested in getting a deeper understanding of Stoicism and how it's helpful in our lives, this is such a great entry point. So, for listeners that are interested in learning more about you and your book, where's the best place for them to connect?
Through my website, which is markmatusik.com. People can also check out my self-inquiry group. It's called theseekersforum.com. And there's lots of information in there about the book, about Stoicism. And if folks want to reach out to me personally, I'm always happy to correspond.
All the links for this episode will be at mindlove.com/306. Your challenge for this week is to find that pause. You know, that little space between what happens to us and how we respond to it. And once you find the pause, use it for self-inquiry. Or you can think of it as using it to challenge your usual patterns. There's no right or wrong way to do this, but I'll bring you back to some of the questions that I find helpful. How will I judge this? How will I respond? Does this say more about me or about them? Or does this say more about me or what they're just going through right now? What's the kindest way that I can see this? How can I view this person with compassion? How can I view this situation with compassion? Like I said, there's no right or wrong way to do this. And as you start practicing, what I recommend is allowing the pause to sit for a little longer than you're used to, so that you have time to reach within and come up with your own questions. This is the process of self-inquiry. This is what we want to get good at, is figuring out how to challenge yourself, how to dig deep and find the answers that you're looking for within you, and trust that they're there just waiting to be risen. If you loved this episode, please consider sharing it by taking a screenshot and sharing it on Instagram, tagging MindLove Melissa and MindLove Podcast. You can check out our membership options at mindlove.com/membership. There's all sorts of goodies in there. It's a really exciting community to be a part of. You can find all of my sponsor promos and deals at mindlove.com/sponsors. And that's all for today. So thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into Your Higher Frequency with Mind Love. Head to mindlove.com for a free gift to keep your vibes up until next week.
Basketball game? Crushed it. And the day's just getting started. Now, kicking it with my crew. When I need a quick snack, Go-Go Squeeze Active Fruit Blend with electrolytes pouches are always in the starting lineup. Made with real fruit and select electrolytes. And so tasty. From workouts to hangouts to whatever's next, I go with Go-Go Squeeze Active. Snag yours on your next store run. Available on Amazon.